You open your mailbox expecting past-due bills. Instead, you find a heavy, wax-sealed letter claiming you are the sole heir to a 40-acre estate left by a woman whose name you've never heard. Would you walk away or sign the papers? For Nora Hastings, that signature unlocked a living nightmare. In the autumn of 2021, 28-year-old Nora Hastings was living a life defined by exhaustion. She was renting a cramped, drafty apartment in South Boston, working 50 hours a week as a freelance graphic designer, and still barely making enough to cover her student loans. She had no safety net. Her parents had passed away in a car accident when she was a teenager, and she had been raised in the foster system, disconnected from whatever extended family she might have had. So when a thick envelope made of expensive cream-colored linen paper arrived in her rusty mailbox, Nora assumed it was a scam. The return address read, Thomas Redfield Attorney at Law, Brattleboro, Vermont. Nora almost threw it in the recycling bin, but curiosity, perhaps fueled by the desperation of a rapidly depleting checking account, won out. She sliced it open. Inside was a formal summons, requesting her immediate presence at the Redfield Law Office to discuss the estate of the late Rachel Carmichael. Nora didn't know a Rachel Carmichael. She didn't know anyone in Vermont. But 3 days later, she found herself sitting in a leather chair in a mahogany-paneled office, staring at a silver-haired lawyer who looked at her over the rim of his reading glasses with a mixture of pity and intense curiosity. "Miss Hastings?" Thomas Redfield began, his voice gravelly. "Rachel Carmichael passed away 3 weeks ago, at the age of 92. She was the owner of the Carmichael Orchards, a 40-acre heirloom apple farm in Windham County, and according to her final will and testament, she has left the entire estate, the land, the farmhouse, the equipment, and the remaining assets entirely to you." Nora laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "Mr. Redfield, there has to be a mistake. I've never met a Rachel Carmichael. My family is from Ohio, not Vermont. You have the wrong Nora Hastings." Redfield slid a manila folder across the desk. "I assure you we do not. Rachel was very specific. She provided your social security number, your current address, and even your mother's maiden name. It is legally watertight. However," the lawyer paused, lacing his fingers together, "the inheritance comes with a highly unusual stipulation." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. "What kind of stipulation?" "Rachel insisted that before the deed can be officially transferred to your name, and before you are permitted to sell the property, you must live in the main farmhouse for 30 consecutive days. If you leave the property for more than 24 hours during that month, the entire estate defaults to a local historical society." Redfield leaned forward. "Miss Hastings, I strongly advise you to consider this carefully. The farm has been abandoned for over a decade. It is isolated. The house is in a state of deep disrepair." But Nora wasn't hearing the warnings. She was hearing the words, 40-acre estate. Even if she just survived the 30 days and sold the land to developers, it would mean millions. It was a ticket out of her miserable hand-to-mouth existence. "Where do I sign?" she asked. 2 days later, Nora packed her entire life into her beat-up Honda Civic and drove north into the dense, colorful mountains of Vermont. The GPS lost signal long before she reached her destination. Following Redfield's hand-drawn map, she turned off the paved highway onto a rutted gravel road that wound deeply into a forgotten valley. The entrance to the Carmichael Orchards was marked by a pair of crumbling stone pillars choked with dead ivy. As Nora drove through, the world seemed to darken. The apple trees, unpruned for years, had grown wild and monstrous. Their twisted, gnarled branches formed a dense canopy that blocked out the late afternoon sun. The ground was blanketed with rotting apples, filling the cool autumn air with the thick, sickly sweet scent of fermentation. At the end of the long drive sat the farmhouse. It was a massive 3-story Victorian structure that might have been beautiful 50 years ago. Now its white paint was peeling off in long scabs, one of the porch pillars was visibly sagging, and the windows stared out like hollow, dead eyes. Nora killed the engine. The silence was deafening. She stepped out her boots, crunching on the gravel, and immediately felt the prickle of eyes on the back of her neck. "You shouldn't be here." Nora gasped and spun around. Stepping out from the shadow of the rotting barn was a man. He looked to be in his late 60s with skin like weathered leather and a thick, unruly grey beard. He wore a faded flannel shirt and held a rusted pitchfork in his calloused hands. "Who are you?" Nora demanded, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "Samuel Griggs," the man grunted, not moving an inch. "I live down the ridge. Kept an eye on this place for Rachel when she got too old to walk the perimeter. She never mentioned a granddaughter." "I'm not her granddaughter," Nora said, grabbing her duffel bag from the trunk. "I'm the new owner." Samuel's eyes narrowed, sweeping over her, as if assessing a particularly weak piece of timber. "Owner. Right. Well, owner, you better lock the doors at night. The wood here is old and the ground is restless. Rachel didn't die of old age, girl. She died of fright." Before Nora could ask what the hell he meant, Samuel turned and vanished into the dense thicket of the apple trees, leaving Nora alone with the decaying house and the suffocating smell of rotting fruit. The first 3 nights at the Carmichael estate tested every ounce of Nora's sanity. The house was a sprawling labyrinth of drafty hallways, floral wallpaper peeling at the seams, and furniture shrouded in yellowing dust covers. There was no internet and cell service required hanging halfway out the second-story bathroom window. But worse than the isolation were the noises. The old house groaned and settled with sounds that mimicked heavy footsteps. The wind whistling through the cracked window panes sounded entirely too human. On the 4th morning, determined to shake off her growing paranoia, Nora decided to inventory the house. If she was going to sell the estate in 26 days, she needed to know what was inside. She started on the ground floor, moving through the suffocatingly cluttered living room until she found a heavy oak door at the end of the hall that refused to budge. It was locked from the outside with a heavy brass padlock. Why lock a room inside your own house? Nora went out to the barn, found a rusted crowbar, and spent 20 minutes violently working the metal until the padlock finally snapped. She pushed the heavy door open, coughing as a cloud of stale, musty air hit her face. It was a study. Unlike the rest of the house, which was cluttered with decades of hoarding, this room was meticulously organized. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with agricultural ledgers dating back to the 1920s. In the center of the room sat a massive, beautifully carved roll-top desk. Nora approached the desk and rolled up the wooden cover. Inside were stacks of perfectly ordered letters, a dried inkwell and a magnifying glass. As she ran her fingers along the back panel of the desk, she felt a slight groove. A cabinet maker's trick. She pressed hard on a small wooden knot, and with a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open. Nora held her breath. Inside the drawer lay a single, velvet-lined box and a stack of faded black and white photographs, bound by a brittle rubber band. She picked up the first photograph. It showed 2 young women, likely in their early 20s, standing beneath the canopy of a blossoming apple tree. One was undoubtedly a younger Rachel Carmichael, her chin tilted up in an arrogant smile. But it was the second woman that made Nora's blood run cold. The second woman had the exact same almond-shaped eyes, the exact same slight curve of the nose, and the exact same smile as Nora. Nora turned the photo over. On the back, written in elegant looping cursive, were the words Rachel and Evelyn. The day we buried the truth. 1974. Evelyn, Nora's grandmother. Nora sank into the desk chair, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had died long before Nora was born, and her parents had rarely spoken of her. What was Evelyn doing in Vermont? Why was she friends with Rachel Carmichael? And what truth had they buried? Before she could process the revelation, the sound of an engine tore through the silence of the farm. Nora rushed to the front window. A sleek silver Mercedes SUV was bouncing violently up the rutted driveway. It came to an aggressive halt near the porch, and a man stepped out. He was in his early 40s, wearing a tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the dying orchard. He marched up the porch steps and pounded on the front door. Nora opened it, leaving the chain engaged. "Can I help you?" "Nora Hastings, I presume," the man said, offering a tight plastic smile. "I'm Derek Carmichael. Rachel was my aunt." Nora tightened her grip on the door. Mr. Redfield didn't mention any surviving family. Redfield is an old fool who follows the letter of the law over common sense. Derek sneered, dropping the friendly facade. My aunt was completely out of her mind in her final years. Dementia, paranoia. She had no right to leave this property to a stranger. It belongs to the Carmichael family. "Take it up with the probate court, then," Nora said, moving to close the door. "Wait." Derek thrust a leather briefcase into the crack of the door to stop it from closing. He popped the latches and flipped it open. Inside were neat banded stacks of $100 bills. $250,000, Derek said softly. "Cash. Right now. All you have to do is pack your bags, get in your car, and drive back to Boston. You break the 30-day residency clause, the property defaults, and I have the connections at the Historical Society to buy it back for pennies. You get rich, I get my family's land. Everyone wins." Nora stared at the money. 2 days ago, she would have taken it in a heartbeat, but the photograph of her grandmother burned in her pocket. There was a reason Derek was here, dressed in a $5,000 suit, desperate to get her off this land. "Why do you want it so badly?" Nora asked. "The house is rotting. The trees are dead." Derek's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine menace crossing his manicured features. "You don't belong here, little girl. You have no idea what's buried in this soil. Take the money before you end up like my aunt. Or worse, like your grandmother." Nora slammed the door shut, throwing the deadbolt. She stood trembling in the hallway as Derek pounded on the wood one last time before storming back to his Mercedes. The tires spat gravel as he sped away. He knew about Evelyn. He knew about her grandmother. Panic and adrenaline surged through Nora's veins. Derek wasn't trying to buy the land. He was trying to buy whatever Rachel had hidden here, the truth that Rachel and Evelyn had buried in 1974. As dusk settled over the valley, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black, Nora grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar from the kitchen. She needed to know what they were hiding. She thought about the strange, hollow, thudding sounds she had heard at night. They always seemed to originate from below her. She found the door to the root cellar off the kitchen pantry. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended into the freezing, earth-scented darkness. The cellar was massive, lined with decades-old wooden barrels that smelled intensely of vinegar and decay. Nora swept her flashlight across the stone foundation. Nothing looked out of place. Just damp earth and fieldstone. But as she moved toward the back of the cellar, the beam of her flashlight caught a bizarre discrepancy. The mortar between the stones on the far north wall was a different color. It was grayer, newer than the century-old crumbling dust of the surrounding walls, and piled in front of it were a half-dozen massive iron-banded cider barrels. Setting her flashlight on a crate, Nora braced her shoulder against the nearest barrel and pushed. It barely budged. Sweating, grunting with exertion, she used the crowbar as a lever, slowly rolling the heavy barrels out of the way. When the wall was finally cleared, Nora traced her fingers over the stonework. She tapped the handle of the crowbar against the stones. Clack, clack, solid stone. She moved 2 feet to the right and tapped again. Thud, thud. It was hollow. It wasn't a stone wall at all. It was a false front, painted and plastered to look like the foundation. Nora wedged the flat edge of her crowbar into a crack between the stones and leaned all her weight backward. With a sickening crack of splitting wood and plaster, a large section of the false wall gave way, collapsing outward into the cellar in a cloud of choking white dust. Nora grabbed her flashlight and pointed it into the jagged dark hole she had just created. What the beam illuminated made her drop the crowbar in sheer terror. The beam of Nora's heavy-duty flashlight cut through the swirling century-old dust, illuminating a space that was never meant to be found. Beyond the shattered plaster and fieldstone lay a sprawling, reinforced subterranean bunker. Nora slowly stepped through the jagged hole, the air inside instantly dropping 10 degrees. It smelled of dry earth, oxidized metal, and a faint lingering odor of dry rot. She swept the light across the room. Stacked against the far wall were dozens of rotting olive-green canvas duffel bags. The fabric on several had disintegrated, entirely spilling their contents onto the dirt floor, neat, mouldering stacks of $100 bills, and beneath them, the unmistakable dull gleam of tarnished silver and gold bars. Nora's breath hitched. It was a fortune, millions of dollars sitting forgotten beneath a dying apple farm. But as she panned the flashlight to the right, the beam caught something else, and a scream died in her throat. Slumped in the corner, chained to a thick iron ring, bolted deep into the bedrock, was a human skeleton. The remains were clad in the tattered, moth-eaten remnants of a 1970s polyester suit. The skull was tilted forward, and resting on its lap was a heavy, rusted revolver. Next to the skeletal remains sat a small wooden milk crate, serving as a makeshift table. On it lay a kerosene lantern, a dried ink bottle, and a leather-bound journal. Trembling violently, Nora approached the crate. She picked up the journal. The leather was brittle, flaking off onto her hands. She opened to the first page. The elegant looping cursive was identical to the writing on the back of the photograph upstairs. If you are reading this, the first line read, "Arthur is dead, and the devil has finally collected his due." Nora flipped through the pages, her flashlight shaking, as she read her grandmother's frantic, terrified confessions. In the summer of 1974, Evelyn and Rachel were 22 years old. Rachel had recently married Arthur Carmichael, a charismatic but violently abusive man who had dragged Rachel into a world of organized crime. In September of that year, Arthur and 2 accomplices pulled off the infamous Green Mountain Depository heist, stealing over $3 million in untraceable cash and bullion. But Arthur was greedy. According to Evelyn's journal, Arthur murdered his accomplices and brought the entire haul back to the farm to hide it in the old bootlegger's cellar. That night, a drunken Arthur boasted to Rachel that he was going to take the money and flee to Canada, but not before tying up loose ends. He planned to kill Rachel and Evelyn, who had been staying at the farm to help her friend through a difficult pregnancy. "We had no choice," Evelyn wrote on the final page, the ink stained with dried tears. Rachel crushed a dozen foxglove roots from the garden and stirred them into his evening cider. When he collapsed, we dragged him down here. We chained him to the wall while he was still paralyzed. He was screaming, begging, cursing us to hell as we laid the bricks for the false wall. We buried him alive with his precious gold. Nora stared at the skeleton, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. Her grandmother wasn't just a runaway. She was a survivor. Evelyn had fled to Ohio to escape the paranoia, changing her identity, while Rachel stayed behind, living directly above the tomb for 50 years to ensure nobody ever found the money or the body. She never slept a full night after that, a raspy voice echoed from the cellar entrance. Nora spun around, dropping the journal. Standing in the jagged opening of the wall was Samuel Griggs. He held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles pointed toward the floor, but his eyes were fixed on the skeleton in the corner. "Samuel," Nora stammered, backing away. I can explain." "No need." The old man sighed, stepping into the bunker. He looked tired, the deep lines on his face sagging under the weight of a decades-old secret. I was a rookie deputy sheriff in Windham County back in '74. I was the one who responded to Rachel's frantic call about her husband abandoning her. I searched the house. I saw the wet mortar on this wall. You knew? Nora asked, stunned. You knew there was a man walled up in here. I knew Arthur Carmichael was a monster who broke Rachel's ribs on a monthly basis, Samuel said softly, his grip tightening on the shotgun. And I loved her. So I wrote up a report saying Arthur fled the state. I quit the force. A year later, bought the cabin down the ridge and spent the next 50 years making sure nobody came snooping around her orchards. Samuel looked at Nora, his expression hardening. But Rachel is gone, and Derek Carmichael is just like his father. He's been trying to get this land for years, convinced Arthur hid the heist money here before he disappeared. The moment he heard Rachel left the estate to Evelyn's granddaughter, he knew his time was running out. He won't stop Nora. He'll kill you to get what's in those bags. As if on cue, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the kitchen above. He's here, Samuel whispered, raising the shotgun. He didn't drive back to Boston. He waited for dark. A loud crash shook the floorboards overhead as the front door was kicked in. Muffled shouts drifted down the stairs. Derek hadn't come alone. There's a ventilation tunnel at the back of this bunker, Samuel said urgently, shoving Nora toward the dark recesses of the cellar. It leads out to the old irrigation trench in the north orchard. Go, now. I'm not leaving you, Nora protested. I promised Rachel I'd protect her secret, and I intend to keep it, Samuel growled. He racked the shotgun. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Run, girl! Nora scrambled over the rotting canvas bags, squeezing herself into the narrow earth-packed tunnel, just as the heavy wooden door at the top of the cellar stairs was kicked open. The tunnel was terrifyingly tight, smelling of wet clay and dead roots. Nora crawled on her hands and knees in pitch blackness, the sound of her own ragged breathing drowning out the chaos behind her. Suddenly, a thunderous boom echoed from the cellar. Samuel's shotgun followed instantly by the sharp, rapid cracks of a high-caliber handgun. Nora sobbed, pushing herself faster, her fingernails tearing against sharp rocks. Finally, she felt a draft of freezing night air. She pushed through a grate covered in dead ivy and tumbled out into the muddy, leaf-strewn trench of the north orchard. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by thick storm clouds. The gnarled branches of the unpruned apple trees looked like twisted skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Nora scrambled out of the trench and began running blindly through the orchard, her boots slipping on the slick, rotting apples that carpeted the ground. Find her! Derek's voice roared from the direction of the farmhouse. She's out back, spread out. Nora ducked behind the thick trunk of a massive heirloom tree, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle her gasps. Through the branches, she could see two beams of high-powered flashlights sweeping across the orchard. Derek and a hulking man in a leather jacket holding a suppressed pistol were advancing through the trees. You can't hide in here, Nora, Derek yelled, his voice laced with manic glee. Samuel is dead. It's just you and me. Give up the deed, and I'll make it quick. Nora's heart shattered for the old man who had given his life to protect her. She looked around desperately. She couldn't outrun them in the dark, and she had no cell service to call for help. But she had an advantage, they didn't. She had spent the last 4 days mapping this property. She remembered the old cider-pressing pit. Samuel had warned her about it on her second day. It was a 15-foot-deep concrete well at the edge of the East Orchard, used in the 1920s to dump rotten fruit. The wooden planks covering it had rotted through decades ago, now hidden by a thick blanket of dead leaves and overgrown briars. Nora picked up a fallen apple, took a deep breath, and hurled it as hard as she could to her left. It smashed against a tree trunk. Instantly, the flashlight beams snapped toward the sound. Over there! The hired thug barked, moving quickly to the left. Taking advantage of the distraction, Nora broke cover and sprinted right, heading dead east. The rustling of her jacket gave her away. "There she is!" Derek shouted. He broke into a run, crashing through the brush after her. Nora pushed herself to the absolute limit branches, whipping against her face and tearing her clothes. She could hear Derek's heavy footsteps gaining on her. She counted the rows of trees in her head. 7, 8, 9. She saw the rusted iron post that marked the edge of the old pressing pit. Nora altered her path, sprinting directly toward the post. At the last possible second, she planted her foot on a solid root and vaulted sideways, throwing herself into a cluster of thick blackberry bushes. Derek, sprinting blindly in the dark with his eyes fixed on the spot she had just vanished from, didn't stop. He took 2 more steps. There was a loud, sickening crunch of snapping timber, followed by a scream that tore through the quiet Vermont night. Derek disappeared into the earth. A heavy, echoing crack of bone against concrete sounded from the bottom of the pit, followed by agonizing, high-pitched wailing. The hired thug heard the screams and came running, his flashlight cutting through the trees. He skidded to a halt at the edge of the pit, looking down at his employer. Nora didn't wait. While the thug was distracted, she crawled out of the bushes and bolted toward the barn. She found Samuel's old rusted pickup truck hidden behind the tractor. The keys were tucked behind the sun visor, just as he had shown her. She fired up the engine, threw it into gear, and tore down the gravel driveway, not stopping until she reached the paved highway, and her phone finally lit up with 3 bars of service. She dialed 911. The aftermath was a media spectacle. State police swarmed the Carmichael orchards. They found Derek at the bottom of the pit with compound fractures in both legs. His hired gun had fled, but was apprehended at a gas station 10 miles down the road. In the cellar, paramedics found Samuel Griggs. He had taken a bullet to the shoulder, but miraculously had survived. The police also uncovered the false wall, the skeleton of Arthur Carmichael, and the millions of dollars in stolen cash and silver. Because the Green Mountain Depository had been insured, and the insurance company had dissolved in the 1990s, the legal battle over the recovered loot was complex. However, due to the statute of limitations, her cooperation, and her status as the legal heir to the estate, Nora was awarded a massive finder's fee by the state. Nora didn't flee back to Boston. She stayed. She completed her 30 days officially, signing the deed into her name. She used the reward money to renovate the crumbling Victorian farmhouse and hire a crew to save the heirloom apple trees. She paid for Samuel's medical bills, giving the old man a permanent rent-free home in the guest house. Nora Hastings had arrived at the Carmichael orchards as an exhausted, orphaned renter, desperate for a quick payout. But as she stood on the wraparound porch the following autumn, watching the orchard bloom with thousands of crisp red apples, she realized she had found something entirely different. She had unearthed her family's darkest secret, but in the process, she had found her roots. She had found home. Nora risked everything to uncover a 50-year-old family secret, turning an abandoned, rotting farm into a thriving legacy. But what would you have done? Would you have taken Derek's $250,000 cash bribe and walked away from the danger, or would you have smashed down that cellar wall to find the truth? Drop a comment below. And let us know if you enjoyed this real-life mystery. Make sure to hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more incredible stories.